She slid the folded paper across the table like she was dealing a winning hand in a poker game, and she said it loud enough for the whole dining room to hear, that the deed to the lake house had already been changed, that my name and my children's names had been removed months ago, and that after tonight, none of us would ever set foot on that property again. Her lips curled into that same tight, satisfied smile she always wore whenever she thought she had finally cornered me, and for one long second, the room went completely silent, forks frozen midair, my husband's fork included. I let that silence sit there. I let her enjoy it for exactly as long as she needed to, because I wanted her to feel every ounce of that false victory before I took it apart piece by piece. Then I set down my napkin, folded my hands on the table, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, I already knew. Her smile cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. My name is Rachel Kessler, I'm 42 years old, and I live in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood outside of Asheville in North Carolina, in a house my husband Daniel and I bought together 12 years ago, back when his family still pretended to like me. We have 2 children, Emma, who is 11, and Caleb, who just turned 8, and for over a decade I did everything right. I showed up to every holiday. I hosted every birthday. I smiled through every backhanded comment his mother, Judith, made about my cooking, my parenting, my career, even the way I dressed. I told myself that was just how some mothers-in-law were, that if I stayed patient and kind long enough, she would eventually come around. If you have ever been the one in your family who did everything right and still got treated like an outsider, if you have ever smiled through Thanksgiving dinner while someone quietly tried to erase you from your own family's future, then you need to stay with me for this one, because this story has a lesson in it you cannot afford to miss, and if that sounds like your life even a little, I want you to subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories right now, because this channel exists for women exactly like us, women who stayed quiet for far too long. The lake house sits on Lake Lure, about 40 minutes from where we live, a beautiful 3-bedroom cabin with a wraparound porch that Daniel's father, Walter, built with his own hands back in the 1980s. Walter passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack, sudden, brutal, no warning at all, and in the months before he died, he sat me down alone on that very porch and told me something Judith never knew he said. He told me that the lake house was meant for all of his grandchildren, not just some of them, and that he had already spoken to his lawyer about making sure it stayed in the family the right way, split evenly, no favorites, no games. He looked at me with those tired, kind eyes and said, Rachel, you've been more of a daughter to this family than my own daughter has, and I want you to remember that when I'm gone. I never forgot those words. I held on to them like a lifeline, because within a year of his death, Judith started rewriting history. She began telling relatives that Walter had always intended the lake house to go to her golden child, Daniel's older sister, Vanessa, and Vanessa's 2 kids from her second marriage. Never mind that Vanessa hadn't visited that lake house more than twice in the last 5 years. Never mind that it was Daniel and I who paid for the roof repairs after the storm in 2021, who mowed the lawn every summer, who kept the pipes from freezing every winter while Vanessa posted vacation photos from Cancun. Judith rewrote the story so smoothly, so confidently, that even some of Daniel's cousins started repeating it as fact. And Daniel, sweet, conflict-avoidant Daniel, kept telling me not to worry, that his mother would never actually do anything drastic, that it was just talk. I loved him for his optimism. I also knew, deep down, that his mother was capable of far worse than talk. The first real crack came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when I stopped by Judith's house to drop off Caleb's baseball cleats that he'd left behind after a family visit. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, so I let myself in and called out her name. No answer. I heard her voice coming from the study down the hall, low, sharp, businesslike, the kind of voice she never used around me. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I want to be honest about that. But I heard her say the words lake house and Vanessa's name in the same sentence, and my feet stopped moving entirely. I stood in that hallway and listened to my mother-in-law tell someone on the phone that the paperwork would be ready by summer, that once it was done, quote, Daniel's wife won't have a single thing to say about it, end quote. My hands went cold. My whole body went cold. But I didn't storm in. I didn't confront her right then and there. Instead, I quietly backed out of that house, got in my car, and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes trying to steady my breathing, because I knew, right in that moment, that this was no longer talk. This was a plan already in motion. And if she wanted to play this game quietly, then I would learn to play it quieter and smarter than she ever imagined I could. That night I didn't tell Daniel what I'd heard, not yet, because I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I brought it to him. The next morning, I called Walter's old attorney, a soft-spoken, sharp-eyed man named Arthur Bellwether, who had handled the Kessler family's affairs for over 30 years. I told him what I'd overheard, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line before he said something that changed everything. He told me that Walter had, in fact, filed an updated trust document 4 months before he passed away, one that named all 3 grandchildren, Emma, Caleb, and Vanessa's 2 kids, as equal beneficiaries of the lake house property, with explicit language preventing any single family member from unilaterally selling, transferring, or redeeding the property without full agreement from all named beneficiaries or their legal guardians. In other words, Judith legally could not do what she was planning to do. Not without forging something, or without every single one of us signing off on it. Arthur told me he still had the original notarized copy in his firm's vault, untouched, unaltered, filed with the county recorder's office the same week it was signed. My mother-in-law had spent months building a lie on top of a foundation that didn't exist. I want you to imagine sitting on that information for weeks, watching her act like a woman with all the power in the world, watching her drop little comments at dinner about how the lake house would finally be, quote, in the right hands soon, and having to smile and nod like none of it touched me. That takes a very particular kind of patience, the kind you only learn after years of being underestimated by people who think your silence means weakness. Every family gathering after that call to Arthur became a performance for me, a controlled experiment in restraint. I watched Judith float around the room dropping hints, watched Vanessa smirk into her wine glass every time the lake house came up, and I simply smiled, asked polite questions, and quietly gathered more information every single time. If you've ever had to sit across a table from someone who was actively working against you while pretending everything was fine, you already understand exactly the kind of exhausting patience I'm talking about, and I promise you, it pays off. Somewhere around month 3 of this quiet standoff, I discovered something even more unsettling. Judith had hired a separate, out-of-state notary, a woman named Denise Pruitt, to draft what she was calling a supplemental family agreement, a document designed to look official, one that Judith intended to have Daniel sign during an upcoming visit, claiming it was simply an update to insurance paperwork on the property. Daniel, trusting his mother the way sons often trust their mothers even when they shouldn't, had already agreed to look it over. I found the draft sitting in his email inbox one evening while helping him print something for work, and my stomach dropped the moment I read the first paragraph. Buried in dense legal language on page 3 was a clause quietly transferring Daniel's ownership stake in the lake house directly to Judith, to be, quote, redistributed at her discretion among grandchildren she deems appropriate stewards of the family legacy. In plain English, Judith was trying to trick her own son into signing away his children's inheritance, and mine, without either of us ever realizing what we'd agreed to until it was already done. That was the moment everything shifted for me from quiet observation into action. I sat Daniel down that same night, showed him the email, walked him through every line, and watched his face change from confusion to disbelief to something I had genuinely never seen in him before, a cold, quiet fury directed at his own mother. He kept saying, she wouldn't do this, she wouldn't actually do this to us, and I had to remind him gently but firmly that she already had, that this wasn't hypothetical anymore, it was sitting right there in his inbox with her name attached to the notary request. That night, for the first time in our marriage, Daniel stopped defending his mother's intentions and started asking me what we needed to do to protect our kids. I told him we needed Arthur Bellwether on a call, first thing in the morning, and we needed to do this the right way, carefully, with paperwork, with proof, with absolutely no room for Judith to claim she'd been misunderstood. Arthur laid it out plainly on that call. Because the original trust document was already filed and notarized through the county, any competing document Judith tried to introduce would hold zero legal weight unless Daniel knowingly and willingly signed away his rights, which meant the real danger wasn't Judith's paperwork itself. It was Daniel almost signing it without understanding what it meant. Arthur suggested something that honestly gave me a small thrill of vindication. He suggested we let Judith believe her plan was working. Let her believe the supplemental agreement was moving forward. Let her show her hand completely, in front of witnesses, so there could never be any confusion later about her intentions. Daniel wasn't fully comfortable with the idea of playing along with a lie, but I reminded him that his mother had been lying to our faces for the better part of a year, and sometimes the only way to expose a liar completely is to let them believe they've already won. So we waited. We smiled through 2 more family dinners. I complimented Judith's pot roast even though it was dry as always. I asked polite questions about Vanessa's kids' summer camp schedules. And underneath all of it, Arthur quietly filed a formal notice with the county recorder confirming the validity of Walter's original trust, timestamped and dated well before any supplemental agreement could be introduced, which meant Judith's plan was now legally dead in the water whether she knew it or not. Meanwhile, I started collecting my own evidence, screenshots of text messages Vanessa had sent Judith joking about, quote, finally getting what we deserve, calendar records proving Daniel and I had covered every single maintenance cost on the property for the past 5 years. Even old voicemails Walter had left me thanking me for taking care of his home when no one else would. I wasn't just protecting my children's inheritance anymore. I was building an airtight case that would make it impossible for Judith to ever spin this story her way again. The dinner where everything finally came to a head happened on a warm Sunday evening in September, at Judith's house, with the whole family gathered under the pretense of celebrating her birthday. Vanessa was there with her kids, Daniel's cousins had driven in from Charlotte, and Judith was practically glowing all evening, clearly anticipating the moment she'd been building toward for months. Partway through dessert, she cleared her throat, tapped her wine glass, and announced to the entire table that she had, quote, taken care of some important family business regarding the lake house, and that starting next month, the property would officially be transferred into a new arrangement that better reflected, quote, who truly valued this family's legacy. She looked directly at me when she said it. She wanted me to shrink. She wanted this to be the moment she finally put the outsider daughter-in-law in her place once and for all, in front of everyone, on her own birthday, no less. That's when I set down my napkin, folded my hands, and told her I already knew. I told her I'd known for months. I watched her smile falter for the first time all night. And then I calmly explained, in front of every single person at that table, that the deed had never actually been changed, that Walter's original notarized trust naming all 3 grandchildren as equal beneficiaries had been on file with the county for over 5 years, and that the supplemental agreement she tried to have Daniel unknowingly sign held absolutely no legal standing whatsoever. I pulled out copies, real, notarized copies Arthur had prepared for exactly this moment, and passed them around the table while Judith sat frozen, her face somewhere between disbelief and panic. Vanessa's smug expression evaporated the instant she realized her mother's promises had never held any legal weight to begin with. Daniel, sitting beside me, didn't say a single word in his mother's defense. Instead, he reached over, took my hand under the table, and simply said, she's telling the truth, and that's the end of it. Judith tried, desperately, to salvage the moment, insisting there had to be some mistake, that Arthur must have made an error, that this was somehow a misunderstanding between lawyers. But when Daniel's cousin Marcus, who happened to be sitting closest to her, picked up one of the notarized pages and read the county filing date out loud, the room went dead silent again, except this time the silence belonged entirely to her. There was no smug smile left on her face. There was nothing left to twist, nothing left to spin, no story she could rewrite in the group chat the next morning to make herself the victim, because every person at that table had just watched the entire truth unfold in real time, with paperwork to prove it. For the first time in 12 years, I watched Judith Kessler have absolutely nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, the fallout wasn't loud or dramatic in the way you might expect. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet, permanent shift in the family's dynamic. Vanessa stopped calling Daniel altogether. Judith sent one stiff, half-hearted apology text weeks later that read more like damage control than genuine remorse, and honestly, I didn't need her apology anymore. I had spent over a decade trying to earn a place in that family through kindness, patience, and quiet loyalty, and none of that had ever been enough for her. What finally earned her respect, or at least her silence, wasn't kindness at all. It was proof. It was preparation. It was refusing to let someone else's lies define my children's future simply because I was too polite to push back. There was a strange quiet in my chest in the days right after that dinner, the kind of quiet that only comes after you've carried a weight for so long that you almost forget what it feels like to set it down. I kept waiting for the guilt to creep in, the old habit of wondering if I had been too harsh, too calculated, too much like the very people who had spent months trying to outmaneuver me. But it never came. What came instead was something closer to peace, the kind that settles in once you realize you no longer have to perform gratitude for people who were never planning to give you anything in return. I thought about all those years I spent trying to win Judith over, baking her favorite pie every Thanksgiving, remembering her birthday down to the exact restaurant she liked, biting my tongue through comments about my parenting that would have made most women walk straight out the front door. I used to think that kind of patience was a virtue. Now I understand it was simply the price of admission into a family that never intended to let me fully belong, no matter how much I gave. Daniel and I talked more honestly in those following weeks than we had in years, about his childhood, about the quiet favoritism Vanessa had always received, about the small ways he'd learned to shrink himself just to keep peace in that house growing up. He told me that watching his mother's face fall at that table was the first time in his adult life he had ever seen her without an excuse ready, without a story to twist the blame onto someone else, and something in him finally clicked into place. He said he felt like he'd spent 38 years waiting for his mother to see him clearly, and instead it took his wife laying out notarized paperwork on a birthday tablecloth to make him see his mother clearly instead. I think that's the part of this story that surprised me most, not the confrontation itself, but how much closure it gave the man I married, a man who had spent his whole life quietly excusing behavior he'd never fully allowed himself to name as wrong. Today, the lake house still belongs to all 3 grandchildren, exactly the way Walter always intended, and every summer, Emma and Caleb spend their vacation days on that same porch where their grandfather once told me I was more of a daughter to him than his own. Daniel and I are closer now than we've ever been, not because a lawsuit brought us together, but because that entire experience forced him to finally see his mother clearly, without the rose-colored filter he'd worn his whole life. And Judith, well, Judith learned that quiet women aren't always weak women. Sometimes we're simply the ones taking notes while everyone else assumes we're not paying attention at all. If this story hit close to home for you, if you've ever had a mother-in-law, a sibling, or even a parent try to quietly write you out of your own family's future while smiling to your face the entire time, I want you to subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories right now, because there are so many more stories just like mine waiting for you here, stories of women who stayed patient just long enough to protect what mattered most. And before you go, I want you to leave a comment below telling me what you would have done in my position, or better yet, tell me about the moment in your own life when you finally stopped staying quiet and started fighting back, because I promise you, someone reading this needs to hear that they're not alone in this either.